Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program titled Deep Listening, Cultivating an Environment for Better Outcomes and Transformation. I'm Tom Valentino, Senior Editor for the Institute for the Advancement of Behavioral Health Care. Today's program is sponsored by Foundations Recovery Network and Aliva. Thank you to our sponsors and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we have a few details we'd like to go over. To submit a question or a technical issue, please use the Q&A area below the slides at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of the program to ask your question. To download a copy of the presentation, please click the link in the Resources tab to the right of your slides. A special note about CE credit: to get your CE, you must watch the program all the way through the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. At the end, do not leave the web page. The site will automatically redirect you to a survey. This must be completed in order to generate your CE certificate. For those watching in a group, please download the group submission guide in the Resources tab and follow the instructions provided. Please note, CE credit is not available for the archived webinar. It is only available for the live event. Finally, for those of you who tweet, please tweet along with us today using our hashtag IABHCLiveWebinar. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, James Hadlock. With more than 9 years in long-term recovery and 25 years of leadership, consulting, and training experience, his views on recovery are thought-provoking. James shares with listeners that there is a missing link in how we build trust and facilitate change with clients in recovery. He's known for his hands-on style, where his blend of stories and research connect with audiences in a practical way. Thank you, James, for taking the time to speak with us today. And with that, the audience is yours.
Oh, well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I'm thrilled for the opportunity to be here and super passionate about talking about this topic in particular. Deep listening really hits home for me, and even though many of you have probably heard about deep listening and probably have your own ideas about what that really means, my hope is that I can give you a little bit more insight. Well, frankly, you'll be able to give yourself a little bit more insight by understanding and learning a little bit more about deep listening. So with that, let's get going. So as I start this out, I want to give another shout out. I know that you mentioned, Tom, a little bit about our sponsors today with Foundations and with Aliva, and I just want to acknowledge both of those organizations. It's been a pleasure working with Foundations and getting prepared for this event. And then Aliva, you know, I've got a little history, and if it wasn't for this EMR company, I wouldn't be here today. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to be introduced to this group. And when I was the marketing director at a facility, I was part of a big beta test that they were doing. And so I've had the opportunity to get to know this group intimately. They're very forward-thinking. They've got some amazing technology. And so if you do get a chance, I would recommend that you check out Aliva and look at some of the innovative things that they're doing. Let's get started with this webinar. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is the 6 topics that we're going to be covering today. And the first one is probably not as scientifically driven as it is just my own experience in this space. And that is this idea that there's really 2 different types of recovery. So I'll be talking about that a little bit. The next thing that I'll want to cover is this idea of what really drives change. You know, what are the things that are really creating that change with clients? And so we're going to explore that. Next, we'll be talking about having a better understanding how insight works. I know that you've probably heard that word, maybe used that word a bunch in your own practice, but today I want to do a deeper dive on what really happens and what is the nature of insight. Next, the 4th topic that we'll be covering is talking about the importance of safe environments. And I know this is something, as I've attended different events and conferences in the addiction recovery space, I know that this is a topic that is being talked about. But here's the thing. There is a lot of science and research to back this up. And today I'll be introducing and talking about polyvagal theory. Some of you probably heard of it before, some of you maybe not so much, but it's very intriguing, interesting, and innovative work that Dr. Steve Porges has laid out. And I will be hopefully connecting some dots and letting you know really the importance of a safe environment from a physiological standpoint. Next, I'm going to be showing you a video. Many of you have probably seen it a number of times by Dr. Brene Brown, but I'm going to link the importance of that safety piece and insight with empathy and talking a little bit about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And I know if you've probably seen that video, you're probably rolling your eyes, but I'm going to tell you when you see the connection and the impact that has in providing an environment for insight, I think it'll give you a little bit more relevance. And finally, something that I'm probably the most known for, whether I'm working with admissions teams or talking with clinicians or presenting on a family day, I'm going to give you a step-by-step process of how deep listening is really a game changer. And again, I know that you've heard of all different types of listening, whether it's, mirror, reflective listening, but today I'm going to give you something to consider as a next level and what I call the ultimate safety measure when it comes to creating these environments for innovation and change. So if you're ready, let's buckle in. And for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to hopefully take you on a journey that will give you a little bit more insight. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I have noticed in my own travels and being in the industry for a while, I've noticed that there are really two kinds of recovery out there that I see people tap into. And again, this isn't scientific by any means, but it's just based on a little bit of my experience. And that first one is probably one that we all relate to and have seen again and again and again. And it's this idea that somebody goes to treatment or gets into therapy and they start replacing their addiction to drugs and alcohol with working out, better nutrition, going to a lot of different support groups, volunteering. Oh my gosh, that's one that I know that I used a lot. And then another one is busy work. And one of the things that I noticed in my own recovery, which I'm going to share a little bit more in detail here shortly, that when I was first looking into trying to get out of addiction, I found myself doing just this. I was gung-ho in working out. I was gung-ho in being busy. And I remember that I had this fear that was always nagging at me. I was concerned that if I got thrown off of a schedule, or if all of a sudden I wasn't able to go to a certain support group, or if for some reason I had gained a little extra weight, all of a sudden it just threw me into this chaos. And I'm almost sure all of you are familiar with this approach, where people just they switch one addiction for, I'm afraid, another one. And here's the thing. It's accompanied with frustration, with struggle, with unsettledness, and underneath it all, if you know what I'm talking about here, that there can be this underlying fear. In fact, I recall just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a group and somebody was celebrating a decade of recovery. This is a time for celebration. This is a time for excitement. And then he said something that just really stuck out to me that I found really disheartening. And it was, he had this belief that if he missed one day of meetings, if he missed one day, that he was scared to death that he would go back to using again. And here's the thing. This approach is probably the most common, and as many of us know, if you're in this industry and have been in this for a while, you know that success is low. That this is where those revolving doors, and we continue to see clients go in and out of detox and in and out of treatment, and they, and when they leave, boy, they are as confident as ever that they're going to have this success, and yet we see them back in 30 days or 90 days or whatever the case may be. And that is unfortunately the reality we live in. You know, our numbers of success are very low. People, though, have such a desire to want to change, and I certainly got to experience that in my own process and in my own recovery. So I want to spend most of our time today talking about the other type of recovery, one that has been a game changer and a life changer for me, and I know for other people, but unfortunately it's something that we don't see often enough. The other type that I'm talking about, of course, is when somebody just has a light switch go on and they have this moment of clarity and things just are clear to them, like they just automatically get it. You know, they may have struggled, and then all of a sudden things just change dramatically for them, and they just stop. And recovery kind of becomes second nature, like it's just a part of who they are now. And my first experience of this was when I was in treatment, my very first time. I've been to treatment a couple. Again, I'll tell you my story in a minute. But I remember this gal that I was in treatment with, and let's call her Carol. And Carol was habitually drinking every day, heavy amounts of alcohol, was somehow able to manage holding a job, kind of, sort of. And as we were going through treatment together in a 30-day program, just one day she just seemed to get it. And I remember her going home. She was living in another state, and I went home. And as we kept in touch and I was checking in with her, she just, like, life was really working for her. And then here I was on the other end, and it was a battle and a struggle. And every single day I felt like I was getting up to just battle the dragon again. And here was Carol, sweet little Carol, here on the other side, where, man, every single time I talked to her, it just, everything was working. And it just seemed like she got it. And I was jealous, and I was wondering, why not me? And so all these different feelings came up, and here I was struggling day to day. And what that ended up looking like were multiple relapses and multiple trips to treatment and multiple trips to the psychiatric ward. And then 10 years ago, I had a transformation. And I got to experience this other type of recovery, this series of aha moments where all of a sudden clarity flooded in, and I literally got to see life differently. And I saw myself differently, and I saw my surroundings differently, and I got to experience this freedom, this absolute freedom that I never thought was possible. I remember my second trip to treatment, and one of my therapists there gave me this scenario where he said, you know, you've got this when you can imagine yourself on a desert island, and you've got your drug of choice or drugs of choice all around you, and it doesn't even occur to you that you want to use. That's when you know you have this. And I remember thinking to myself, that's impossible. That's never going to happen. Well, folks, I'm here to tell you that it does happen, and transformation is possible, and that we can create massive change in our lives as long as we just understand the power of where that transformation happens. So let me give you a little context, and I know I've given you a few hints to my past, but let me just give you a little bit better context so you'll understand where I'm coming from as I start to introduce you to some of this work that I've been doing over the last decade. So I was an overachiever. I was super aggressive in everything I did. I was that go-getter kid, and success just seemed to follow me wherever I went. In my early and mid-20s, I was a successful entrepreneur. I became a millionaire by the time I was 27, 28. And then I went into a different industry, And then life started to get shaky for me. I was feeling a lot of insecurities. I had some tragedy in my life. All of a sudden, some old childhood stuff started coming up. And next thing you knew, I had graduated from using pharmaceutical like muscle relaxants to I started getting into the club drug scene. So ecstasy, GHB, and then that graduated to the heavier stuff, cocaine, Oxycontin, and next thing I knew, within 6 months of not using habitually, I overdosed for my first time. And over about a year period, I had gone from leaving my family. I had gone from completely detaching from everything that I'd grown up believing in my life. Like all my belief systems were thrown out the window. And next thing you know, I was this swinging singles guy that was partying every week, and I didn't have an off button. My off button was I ran out or I overdosed. And over about a 10-year period, I overdosed over 60 times, 60. I did not know how to turn it off because I was in that much pain and that much hurt. I found myself in and out of treatment centers, in and out of therapy sessions, 3 times in the psych ward. In the midst of all this, because of that kind of driver mentality that I had, I managed to build a $20 million company. And yet behind the scenes, I was an absolute wreck. And I was destroying everything in my path. I burned through that money pretty quickly, and within just a few short years, I was bouncing from house to house. I was trying to figure out what was going on with me, and I just couldn't figure it out. And these aha moments that then came 10 years later were just fascinating for me. But here's what I couldn't understand. How could this guy, and by the way, if you don't know who I am, this is a mugshot of me, one of many that I had for multiple DUIs. How could I go from this place to this place? Like, where did that come from? Because here's the thing, I saw everything different, and things had transformed for me in such a way that I did not have the same relationship with drugs and alcohol that I did prior to me being in recovery. It was so drastic. I mean, I wish there were words for me to explain just the shift that had happened in me, but here was the thing that was interesting. Everything, and I mean everything, had stayed the same around me, and yet here I was with a complete new outlook on my life, on the people around me, on drugs, on alcohol, and how that relationship was. And it was kind of a mind blower for me. And I became really confused. In fact, I was so confused. I was almost stunned that this other type of recovery had befalled on me. And here's what was so cool is that confusion turned into curiosity. I went from confusion to curiosity because, I had been taught and I had heard, whether it was in different groups that I was attending or therapy sessions, that for the rest of my life, I was going to be a victim to that addiction. Like it was going to be something that I would have to deal with every single day, if not every single hour of my life. And I was scared. I was angry. I was resentful. I was pissed off. And yet here I was with this new freedom that I just didn't understand. And the fact of the matter is that I changed that confusion into this curiosity, and I started to go on this journey. And so instead of me just going, oh my gosh, it must have been grace, or I've just been blessed, or some angel came and tapped me on the head, I really wanted to figure out what had happened. Because here was the thing. I believe that if I could dissect and deconstruct and figure out what was really going on or what had really happened with me, there might be a chance that I could help other people. And so I began searching, and I began looking at different kinds of modalities and philosophies. And for the last decade, even though I'm not formally trained, I'll tell you that I've become a researcher. And I have looked at, and because I don't have any bias or any training one way or the other, I think it left me open. It left me open to be able to really kind of discover and explore and experiment, because what I was experiencing on the inside was completely different than everything I'd ever been taught about this disease. And so I became curious. And here's what I found out. I found out that there was a lot of research out there that actually supported what I had experienced firsthand. And so as I move forward here and talk a little bit about the actual science and some of the philosophy that I discovered, it's going to be a mix of many different modalities. So we're going to be talking about organizational psychology. We're going to be talking about psychiatry and the behavioral sciences and neuroscience and Eastern philosophy. And all this kind of came to a head for me over the last decade as I've kind of dug in and done the research. But it all started with experience first. Like, this is not stuff that I read in a book first and then had the experience. It was the opposite. I had the real life experience, and then I tried to figure out what that was, dissect all of that. And so hopefully I'm going to speak plainly enough that you can understand this. And again, this is coming from a real world, real life experience. And here's what I've come to understand. I've come to understand, first of all, that transformation is absolutely the key to long-term recovery. Like, if somebody doesn't have a shift, they're going to struggle. And even though you may get the end result of, I'm not drinking and I'm not drugging, I'm sober, if you want that extra element of well-being, if you want to experience more freedom and a settledness like that, just that calm, that settled place, you have to have a transformation. It's not going to come from a book. It's not going to come from me, hearing somebody talk, even though that might point me in the right direction. You've got to have a shift of consciousness. And here's what I know about that. I know that the key to transformation is insight. And of course, we've all heard this term insight before. We use it all the time, right? We think we have insights all the time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between explanation and insight, because there's a big difference there. But what is insight? I mean, we throw that word around all the time, but what is it really? Like, what is that thing, that nebulous idea of insight? Because here's the thing. We've all had those experiences. We're in a conversation with somebody and we're talking about an author, but we can't remember the author's name, and we're thinking, and we're all jammed up in the head. And then 2 days later, we're driving down the road, and all of a sudden the author just out of nowhere, right? Well, that's insight. I mean, it can come from out of nowhere at any given time. But let's talk about the nature of insight. What is that really made up of, and what is the what is that soup of ingredients that make up this word insight? And here's what I've discovered. And some of this research, so for some of you analytical and researchy types, there are references here. I invite you to check out some of this work. It's fascinating. But you'll be able to get some of these sources. They're right on the slides here. But here's the thing that's really interesting to me is let's go back to where do we see insight happen the most in our own personal life. So think about that for just a second. Where where do you seem to have the most insights? Well, the research says that the shower is one of the top places, funny enough, right? So what are the dynamics of that? Like, why would the shower or just going on a walk or just driving, why are those places in particular the places that we have insight? Well, the science actually helps point us in a direction. So let's talk about the nature of insight for a minute. So first of all, in the dictionary, you'll read that, it's a thorough change. It's a spontaneous shift of perspective. And if the word itself literally comes from having sight from within, I like to call that inner wisdom. It's where just all of a sudden, I see something differently. It's overcoming an assumption and being able to see a new perspective. So, I might be minding my own business and, not thinking about a whole lot. And then all of a sudden just something clicks. Here's what I've noticed about insight is that when I have an insight, it seems to be something that sticks. Like it seems to come with this deeper feeling, right? Like, you could even have a concept down and you understand a certain thing. And then just one day out of the blue, you have this insight. And it might be that same exact concept, but it feels deeper. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know where I'm going with that? I mean, it's, I know you've experienced it. I know each one of us has, because it's an innate part of being human, is this ability to tap into this creative new perspective that just sometimes just shows up out of nowhere. And here's the other thing. It seems to come when we least expect it. I mean, seriously, I've known on many occasions where I'm all trying to think through a problem, and then I just get frustrated. I'm like, okay, screw it, and I'm done. And I don't think about it. In fact, I just kind of let it go. And then 3 days later, I'm literally in the shower, and all of a sudden, bam! All of a sudden, I just have this flash of clarity, and it's just like, yeah, where did that come from? But my gosh, that's the exact answer that I'm looking for. And it just clicks. And then there's this other piece. I know a lot of times people will say, oh, well, yeah, no, that's a nice insight, when what they're really meaning to say is, well, that was a nice explanation. And it kind of goes back to this idea of, there's the matter of fact side of life, where that just, makes sense. But then there's just that next level where insight comes in or emerges or bubbles up from inside of us. And it seems to just lock in. And so let me talk to you on a very personal level on what that looked like for me 10 years ago when I had this transformation. You see, I was deeply suicidal, and I had gotten to a point where I had put a plan together, and I'm in a seedy hotel in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I had a plan, and I knew exactly how I was going to play that one out. Nobody knew where I was at. I managed to separate myself from everybody. And here I am in this hotel, and I am completely out of my head. I'm completely inebriated. I've been drinking for about a week because I didn't have the courage to muster up this suicidal plan. And then something amazing happened. I had this little insight. You see, at the time, I had 2 daughters. They were younger, and I had been in and out as a dad. I'd been, divorced for some time now, but I remember having this thought, and it felt deeper than just a thought. And I felt that my kids were going to be better off with a deadbeat dad than they were with a dead dad. And that was the thought that I had. And as you can see, that just seems like, well, no kidding, right? But to me, there was some insight there, and it gave me the opportunity to maybe step back for just a moment. And that's when I called my mom. And I said, Mom, can I come home? Can I just come home? And she was in the car and coming after me within minutes. But here's the funny thing about addiction. When I got to my parents' house, I was hiding liquor for about a week. So even though I had the courage and I had this brief insight to go to my folks' house, I was still drinking for about a week. And then that's when it hit me. You see, I discovered through self-inquiry that the reason I was the overachiever and the super go-getter was not because I was the overachiever and super go-getter. I was scared out of my wits that I wouldn't measure up, that I wasn't going to be good enough if I was just normal. And so I had to go above and beyond and be everything and anything for everybody. And so I was over the top in everything I did. Hence, overachiever, hence multimillionaire. I was already living with a ton of insecurities before I started using habitually. And then the most amazing thing happened. You see, I was staying at my parents' house completely destitute. I had nothing. I had lost families, companies, friends, my freedom in a lot of ways. And here I was at my parents' house, and then I asked the question that sparked the biggest insight as it relates to my own recovery, and it was, if I don't have anything for my parents to love, who are they loving right now? And I had that flash of insight, and the answer was, I was worthy of love, that I was okay. And that was the insight that I had that changed everything for me. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's no big deal. Of course your parents love you, but I'm telling you, folks, it was such a massive transformation for me. Like, I saw everything different when that occurred. And here's what I've discovered through that process, that insight is absolutely necessary for lasting change. If it was just all about knowledge and book smarts and intelligence, then why do we have the epidemic that we do here in the United States and all over the world for that matter? We are missing the piece where change really happens, and it's absolutely insight. And the fact of the matter is that we can help or hinder with the type of environment that we create. And this is where some of the most fascinating work comes into play, called Polyvagal Theory. Now, some of you have probably heard of Polyvagal Theory. The fact of the matter is that Dr. Porges, who is the originator of this work, in 1994 is when he started doing this work, and he was working with a lot of veterans. And one of the things that I find really fascinating about his work is when I was introduced to this, and by the way, let me give that just a quick little history on that. My wife and I, I'm now, of course, remarried, but my wife and I, we began facilitating groups where we were teaching some of these basic concepts around deep listening and power of pause and reflection. And one of the things that came out of those group experiences were people were having insights like crazy. It didn't even matter what the topic was that evening. People were just having just crazy amount of insight in their own life, in decision making. And the fact of the matter is that my wife and I were also having a ton of different insights, and we were growing ourselves, even though we were facilitating these groups. And we were just super intrigued by that idea that, what was it about us facilitating this little circle of people? What was it about that formula that allowed for people to have more insights? And that's when my wife, in fact, is the one who began doing the research. And then she stumbled upon Dr. Porges and his work with polyvagal theory. So again, I want to remind you, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a clinician. So I guess the advantage here is that maybe I can speak super plainly and really kind of give you the best and easiest knowledge around polyvagal theory that really anybody can understand. So Dr. Porges with polyvagal theory, part of the basis of his work really started with this idea of being in survival mode and what happens when we feel threatened. And now all of you have heard of course, this idea of fight or flight. Well, here's the thing that's interesting about fight or flight. Fight or flight is something that happens physiologically to us, to our autonomic nervous system. Like when we feel threatened, what happens? Our heartbeat goes up, our breath shortens, we start to think differently. I mean, a lot of things change physiologically to us when, imagine if a bear all of a sudden came through that door right now. What would happen to your body? And what Dr. Porges theorized is that if we have these automatic things happening to us when we are in fight or flight, I wonder what would happen on the other end of the spectrum when we felt ultra safe. Was there something that was going on physiologically with us when we feel safe? And what he discovered was absolutely yes, that there was. In fact, what's really intriguing about this is that if you talk about the different circuits that we use and we pull from, when we feel threatened, we're using those old circuits, those reptilian brain circuits, right, from back 200,000 years ago. And any type of threat whatsoever, whether it's real or not, we're going to go into these defensive modes. And folks, I'm talking about something physiological here. I'm not talking about you even having an awareness around them. In fact, one of the things that Dr. Porges noticed is that when the body, that the body could actually feel risk without even being aware of it. So this is not something that cognitively happens. This is something that happens automatically when the body feels risk. In fact, there wasn't even a word for that, and he came up with this word. So that word neuroception is the word that Dr. Porges came up with to describe that our body is sensing this stuff without us even being aware of it. So you wonder why your clients will get all defensive, even though it doesn't appear like there's anything for them to get defensive about. But I'm telling you, folks, that if they don't feel ultra safe, that they don't have any control over those reptilian circuits kicking in. But here's the good news. If we can call on those newer circuits, the ones that were formed as we became more sophisticated as a human being, that we start to tap in to those softer skills, the ones that actually cultivate our connection and that humanness. So the only way that we tap into that humanness, those newer circuits, is when we feel safe. So things like compassion and openness and vulnerability, they only come when we feel safe. So when we feel judged or labeled or cornered or scared, where are we operating from? What circuits are we actually tapping into? Well, it's those older circuits. It's the reptilian side of us, and we don't even really have control over that. And you know that because if a bear came jumping through that door, you wouldn't have any control of what your body did, right? So just understand that this is physiological. It's not cognitive. We're not even aware of it. So creating that safe environment is so vital to progress, to transformation. One of the other things that he picked up on was some of the facial stuff that happens. And even there's a little bone in our ear that switches when we feel safe. So we let down our guard with peripheral sound and can only hear the person in front of us. And we've all experienced this before. Think of the last time you were in a really engaging conversation in a super loud restaurant. Did you hear the restaurant? No. You heard the person across from you because you felt safe. Well, physiologically, something actually changed. In fact, you'll notice that even your faces start to look a little different when you're in more of those connective kind of experiences, right? So bottom line, when we feel safe with others, we turn off our defenses and relax. We become vulnerable and more trusting. We open up and connect with others, and something really engaging happens, and we start to tune in to new ideas and creativity. In other words, we start to turn into insight. In fact, we are wired in such a way that insight only comes when we feel safe. It's when we use those newer circuits, when we tap into those newer circuits, which again, we don't have that much control over. It's when we tap into that humanness. And you've all had that experience, right? You've had that experience where something just clicked and you were with either a client or a loved one or a sibling or a child, and you have one of those moments that just transcends kind of the sum of the parts, right? We've all had that experience before. Well, this explains it physiologically why that happens, which I think is just super fascinating. So I've talked about the science. I've talked a little bit about insight and how that works. And I want to spend the rest of our time. I want to talk a little bit about how you can actually tap into this more often. And I believe that connection is key. It was key in my own experience. It's been key in the people that I've worked with for the last decade. And I'm willing to bet that you know that it's key too. Connection is key. And deep listening is, I think, one of the ways that we can connect more deeply with people. I call it next level listening. And it is the ultimate safety measure. Now, again, I know that you probably have heard even this term before, but have you really taken the time to understand what that means? Again, it's not like reflective listening. You're going to see some differences here in just a moment. And I'd like to start off by sharing a little bit about a famous experiment called the Rosenhan Experiment. So Dr. Rosenhan, many of you probably heard this before, but did you know that this experiment was huge when it comes to deep listening? So Dr. Rosenhan was a psychologist that was very, very concerned with what was going on in the mental health community. In fact, in the 1970s, so many people were being admitted to psychiatric wards. There was a famous movie that swept at the Oscars called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This was top of mind, folks, in the 1970s because it was everywhere and people were being admitted left and right. And Dr. Rosenhan couldn't understand how we had just become crazy all of a sudden. So he put this experiment together with 7 of his colleagues, most of them in the mental health fields, decided to pose as pseudo-patients. And over a period of time, they visited 12 different facilities, and here was what they decided to do as posing as pseudo-patients. They wouldn't reveal their profession, because obviously most of them were mental health professionals. But number 2, all they would insert, so they would tell them their background and everything, but they would insert a little white lie. They would say that they had heard, past tense, heard voices. And that was it. And they all went through the admissions process just like anybody. And what do you think happened in those 12 hospitals, 8 of them going through the admissions process? How many of them do you think were admitted to the hospital? 20%? 50%? It was 100%. 100%. In fact, all but one of those cases, they were diagnosed with repressed schizophrenia for just saying that one thing. How do you think the mental health community took this news? Not very well. In fact, one hospital came to Dr. Rosenhan and asked if they could be in another experiment, and he agreed. And so over 2 months, what they decided is that they would go through the process with whomever came in, that Dr. Rosenhan at any given time could send a pseudo patient. Dr. Rosenhan agreed. The hospital saw 193 patients over a 2-month period. And when they came back to Dr. Rosenhan, they said, "We think we know how many you've actually sent us. Out of the 193, 41 were plants by you, Dr. Rosenhan, and 42 were possible pseudo patients." So if you do the math, that's 83 people that they thought either for sure were plants or maybe plants by Dr. Rosenhan. How many people do you think Dr. Rosenhan sent? That's right, 0. So what in the world does this have to do with deep listening? Well, it's the very first step to deep listening, and it has nothing to do with listening at all. It has everything to do with seeing. How are you seeing your patients? How are you seeing the people that you're working with? Are you seeing them as manipulators? Are you seeing them as addicts? Are you seeing them as a no way they're going to make it? are you able to transcend their past and actually be able to look them in the eye and see them for the person who is hurting and dying for connection? Because I'm telling you, folks, this is a game changer. When you can see somebody for who they are and not for what they've done, the way that you show up, they're going to see it on your face. The science says so. And I think one of the best videos that I've ever seen that illustrates this is actually a Dane TV commercial. So it's from Denmark. And let's watch that now.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think.
I've always been fascinated with this idea that we need to use labels. And it's interesting that we say we have cancer. It's separate from us, but with addiction, a lot of times we associate with being the addiction as addict. And I think that that's just a small little thing, but it's so important to understand that we don't need to use labels. That we can treat the person and be with them. That's what they're really looking for. I'm going to have to skip with some of this because we have run short on time. But I know a lot of you probably seen the video of empathy versus sympathy. But the second piece of deep listening is really having empathy and compassion. It's trying to understand where they're really coming from. And if you download this session, of course, you'll be able to watch that full video. So let's move on to the third step, and the one that really separates, I think, deep listening from everything that's out there. And it's this idea of withholding judgment and not interrupting a client. And I'm going to add one more piece to this, and it's this idea of we don't need to give advice all the time. Like, it's not your job to have all the answers. And if you understand the power of insight, it's not your job at all, actually. In fact, I've heard many a times, if somebody is in the right mindset to hear your advice, they don't need it. And if they aren't, they're never going to get it. And so what if you were to just cultivate more of this idea of providing the space for them to see things for themselves? I mean, doesn't that make sense? You know, we don't have to come up with all the answers.
You refer to...
Here's the thing that I know, that listening is innate. The fact is that we already have this in us. Like, the only thing that holds us back from being a deep listener and not giving advice and not interrupting and trying to control is our own busy heads. And the more that we can trust in the power of insight, the easier it is for us to really be that facilitator and to be the witness of that change. In fact, deep listening is showing up from a place of compassion and support and saying, I'm here to fix you, and I don't have all the answers, but I'm here for you, and you are okay just the way you are. So in conclusion, here is just a recap on the keys to more insights. And it's, you know, clients want to be seen as themselves, not as broken, not as a pity party, but they want to be seen. Clients don't want your sympathy. They don't need your pity. They want to feel connected. And then finally, they want to be heard. They want to feel safe. And believe it or not, they actually want to get better. I know sometimes we don't feel that way, but they want to get better. And so in conclusion, deep listening is something that happens when we are compassionate, empathetic. It's when we are able to build more trust with our clients. It's when we provide a safe environment for our clients. It's when we listen for insight. I don't know if you've considered this, but when you are deep listening, you're actually opening yourself up to have more insights yourself. And we become inspired instead of matter of fact about things. We actually let the process happen in a more inspired way that we could never even have counted on before with just our book smarts. And finally, we rely on the insight being the teacher, not ourselves. Because here's the fact of the matter, folks. I'm not that smart, and either are you. But that inner wisdom, that is where the magic happens. That's where, in quotation marks, miracles happen. And here's a bonus. Here's the thing that I've experienced, that this feels really good. Like, this is the way to interact with people. It's where you're edified, where they're inspired, and there's just a deeper feeling when you come from this place of deep listening. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tom for any questions and finish up and wrap this up today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, James. That was a very informative presentation. Before we get into the Q&A portion of the event, I would like to hand things over to Christy Krisman from Foundations for a few words from our sponsor.
Thank you so much, Tom. Start your year off right with honest, open conversations about addiction, mental health, and life in recovery. Powered by Foundations Recovery Network, the Recovery Unscripted podcast shares powerful stories and unique insights from experts and trailblazers in the recovery community, such as best-selling author Glennon Doyle, Miss Tennessee Katie Davis, football legend Herschel Walker, and more. Just search for Recovery Unscripted in your podcast app and subscribe to hear new episodes each week. Thank you, and back to you, Tom.
All right, thanks a lot, Christy. We've had some questions coming in already from our audience. However, we'd also like to remind you that you can use the Q&A area below the slides to submit a question at any time. Any questions that we don't get to today, we will pass along to James and might be able to connect with you that way after the webinar is over today. And also a reminder to download a copy of the slides. Please click the Resources tab to the right of the presentation window. All right, let's get into some questions. How do you recognize when someone has insight? How do you decipher the difference between insight and knowledge, especially with those who have had multiple relapses?
Oh, thank you. That's a terrific question. So in my experience, it works just like it would for someone who's having an insight themselves. So you're asking me, how do you determine if someone's had an insight? In my experience, you're going to feel it. It's a deeper feeling. There's almost that same sense of aha for me when I see that in someone else, and again, it's that click, it's that deeper feeling. So there is this interplay of insight actually when you're in those moments, and I think we've all had those. But what a terrific question! Thank you.
All right, next question we have. How do you foster this kind of attitude when working with offenders or clients engaging in dangerous behaviors? How do you let them be who they are?
Well, I think that a lot of times we get so caught up in our heads and we think a situation is going to turn out a certain way. So we get caught up in our own habitual thinking. And then we're actually reacting to something that isn't real when we're coming from that kind of a mindset. And so my experience has been, and the way that I see it is again going back to that idea of being able to see people for who they are, not for their history, not for how many years they've been in prison, not for their offenses. And what's so surprising about that is if I come in from that place, and in almost all instances, they reciprocate. They feel that, and they feel that vulnerability and that genuineness. And here's the thing: everybody, in my experience, is longing to belong. They want connection. And when you understand that, what you'll also understand is all they're doing is they're just jammed up in their heads too. They're confused, they're scared, they're using those reptilian circuits instead of feeling safe. And so coming from this place of deep listening where you are present and you are open and you don't come in with necessarily your own agenda on how it's supposed to be and just let it be what it's going to be, you're going to get far greater results.
All right, we got time. We're going to sneak in one more question here. What advice would you give to parents who are experiencing the other side of addiction with their children?
Oh my gosh, I get that one all the time, probably on a daily basis. And what I would say is love your kids. Don't get so caught up in the behavior. If it wasn't for my mom and dad seeing the greatness in me when I couldn't, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. We get so jammed up with, our own embarrassment because our kids are acting out a certain way. And I'm telling you, if you follow these steps to deep listening and let go of the ego, you're going to find a child that is starving for that love and they want to be there, but because of this understanding of the circuits that we tap in when we don't feel safe and we're scared, we don't have the ability to do that. You've got to transcend the environment, and you do that through deep listening.
All right, James, thanks for sharing, and thanks for answering these questions. Really good stuff. I think that's going to be just about all the time we have for questions for today. We do have some final instructions regarding CE credit. Please do not leave this page. Continue to stay on the platform. The site will automatically redirect you to a survey, and this survey must be completed in order to generate your CE certificate. For those watching in a group, as a reminder, please download the group submission guide and the resources tab to the right of the slides and follow the instructions provided. Please note that CE credit is not available for the archived webinar. It is only available for the live event on January 30th, 2018. If you enjoyed today's program, please join us for a presentation on February 27th by Siobhan Morse titled Opioid Use Disorder Patients, Characteristics and Outcomes from Residential Co-occurring Disorder Treatment. The link to register is in the Resources tab to the right of your presentation window. All right, one more time, I want to thank James Hadlock once again for an excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Foundations Recovery Network and Aliva, for making today's program possible. And finally, a thank you to those of you in our audience for participating today. We hope you will join us in the future for another IABHC webinar. This concludes today's presentation. Have a great day.